Hello everyone, welcome back to another ZBrush quick tip. In this quick tutorial, we're going to be looking at how to set up a ZBrush document so that you can work with it at a reasonable scale that's going to give you a consistent workflow. And then we're going to look at how scale affects dynamesh in ZBrush, and then lastly, how to measure stuff using Transpose Master and Scale Master. If you want to skip to that section, because that's all that you want to do, just measure something while you're working, I'll include a timestamp either below or on screen. All right, so let's jump right in. So here we have the default ZBrush interface. What I'd like to do initially is I'll pretty much always start this way. I just go to Sphere 3D, drag it on the canvas, press T to go into edit mode. From there, I go to make polymesh 3D, and one thing I'm going to point out is before you have created a secondary tool within, or a secondary subtool within your tool, this value here is going to be 0. This creates a problem when you're importing geometry for either as an OBJ or STL. It's going to give you a crazy arbitrary number, and it's going to throw everything off. I'm going to show you how to not have that happen. So one thing you're going to notice is once I hit duplicate here on this sphere, all of a sudden the export value is now at 1, and I'll show you what the difference, what that actually does, because it doesn't seem like it's a big deal, but it makes an enormous difference, and it took me a very long time to figure this out. So I'm going to just redo this again just to show you the difference. So here I have a subtool, Sphere 3D. I'm going to hit make polymesh. Scales at 0, and this time I'm just going to import an item right onto this, and it's going to be a 3D head scan that I got off the internet a long time ago. And what you'll notice is that the export scale is now a crazy number. I don't know where that number comes from. I'm going to append a ball here, and this ball by default is normally 2 ZBrush units, but my whole tool now, where both of these subtools exist, is now living under this scale. And what this does in relation to dynamesh is if I dynamesh this at 128 resolution, you'll notice that he is not very dense, which means that in order to get more detail and pack more detail into him, I would have to go and crank this up and, play around with it until he feels until he's just like a more dense mesh that would give you the resolution that you need to achieve what you're after. But this creates an incredibly inconsistent workflow, because if you're just importing, completely ignoring this value, then one time that you're working on a head or an item or whatever, you could be working at 128 resolution and it's extremely dense. And then another time you might need to go into the thousands of resolution in order to achieve the same level of density. And you're wondering, why is that happening? It's because of this. So let's look at the difference now. I'm going to go ahead and just dynamesh them at 128 so we can see the difference between both of them. So here's 128. I'm going to switch back over to the other tool that I had already established with the export scale of 1. Now I'm going to import the exact same file. Here he is, and he came in way bigger this time. And here's the ball, again, in relation to him. If you remember before, he is about the same size as the ball. He is like 10 times as large as the ball now. And if we dynamesh him with the same resolution, he is now almost 2 million polys compared to 26,000. That is a huge difference. So that's just something to look out. So that's how you set up the ZBrush document. Let's just go through it again real quick. Let's just say we're going to initialize ZBrush real quick. So this is what I do every single time. I hit a sphere, drop it on the canvas, press T. Go to subtool, and then I want to hit make polymesh 3D. That way you have something that's editable, an editable mesh, and then from there you hit duplicate. From here, at this point, you've now established that the export scale is 1, and you can go to town sculpting. So here's how you measure stuff in ZBrush using Transpose Master. The first thing you want to do is hit W, so you can go to the Move tool, and you can see it up here. From there, that'll activate the gizmo by default, and you want to just turn that off, and you can do that by pressing Y, or by pressing this button up here, if assuming you haven't changed your UI. That's going to give you the Transpose tool, and from there you can click and drag on one edge of your model and hold Shift or not all the way across. Just remember that this snaps to geometry, so sometimes it can snap at an angle. So if you don't want that to happen, just click and drag, hold Shift, and it'll be completely straight all the way across. So you're not going to get any kind of weird measurements. As you can see, this sword is measuring 29.9, so I created this so that it is a 30-inch sword. But there's a more accurate way to measure stuff. Assuming that you have kind of like dense geometry, it can be a little bit tricky to get a precise measurement of how big this item actually is. And that is done using Scale Master. Assuming that you followed the earlier part of the tutorial in setting up your ZBrush space properly, you won't have an issue with here. I will probably make a follow-up video on how to use Scale Master because it does have some nuances and it can give you some errors when you're using it, but just keep in mind that Scale Master, which I have here docked on the left, it doesn't like units above 100. So assuming that your item is below 100 units, it shouldn't give you any issues. But there's definitely some nuance to that, so I'll cover that in another video. So just kind of going back here, I have my Z plugin palette is dropped here on the left. If you'd like to do that, you can simply just click and drag the palette and just drop it in there. And just make sure you go to config and you store config afterwards. So that way it retains that for the next time you boot up ZBrush. So from here, you'll notice that looking at the Scale Master plugin, you'll notice that the All button is turned on. This All button scales whatever changes you make when you resize your subtool. Either it's going to be a proportional increase using this ratio. It'll do it to all tools within your subtool, whether they're visible or not. So this is generally too powerful for you and for me. You don't want to do this, generally speaking, unless you actually mean to. So for me, for example, if I wanted to make this sword 50 inches, scaling it up the normal way using the Transpose tool is not very efficient because you'd essentially have to kind of place your transpose line and see, oh, well, I've got, 50 inches. Let's say I want to make this sword 50 inches. And then you'd have to switch over to scale and start scaling this up. Oops. Okay, we don't want to do that. Let's see. 50 inches. And again, not very accurate. You can press 1 if you do it correctly to continue doing that scale up. Let's do that again. So yeah, it's just not efficient to do it that way. So I'm just hitting slider subtool size to see what it's at. So it's currently at 45, but for me, I can just hit 50 and hit resize. So now this sword is 50 inches. We can double check using the transpose again. This will kind of give you a ballpark figure if you're just want to be 100% sure. So it's pretty close. But yeah, it's definitely 50 ZBrush units. Yeah, and assuming that you have this clicked on, it'll be a proportionate scale. It's not going to deform your item by doing it this way, and it's 100 times more accurate than using the transpose tool. Just keep in mind, remember, export scales is 1, and you may have noticed that I stayed away from messing with any of these units of measurements. Personally, I don't press these buttons because they add a lot more complication to the workflow than is truly necessary. If you go above 100 units, it tends to give you an error, and if you hit yes to the prompt, that it resizes everything down or up and changes the export scale value, which then affects your dynamesh resolution and everything, and it just kind of throws everything off within your subtool. So I personally like to make sure to never hit yes on the error prompt that it gives you, and just stay within the 100 units scale for Scale Master to work and actually give you an accurate and functional use. I think that's just a limitation of this plugin, but again, it's extremely useful if you're using it for 3D printing. Thank you so much for sticking around if you've made it this far. don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of this type of content. If you didn't like it, don't forget to hit the dislike button and also leave me a comment as to how I could make things better. See you next time.